Jericho, one of the oldest and most feared fortresses in all of antiquity. The powerful walls protecting this city seemed indestructible, and its inhabitants lived as if nothing could ever harm them. Abundant wealth, unbridled pleasures, and the worship of pagan gods turned the streets into a stage for celebrations and forbidden rituals. Some cults even went so far as to offer women in honor of strange deities, with no one daring to question or fear the consequences. But why was this city, located in the middle of the desert, seemingly unshakable, raised in such a mysterious way? What really happened behind its enormous walls, and how does this story continue to resonate today as a warning for those who do not see beyond appearances? Stay until the end of this video, because what you are about to discover about Jericho may challenge everything you believe. And before we continue, tell me, from which city in the world are you watching this video? I really want to know. Jericho is known as one of the oldest cities in history, emerging at a time when humanity was still learning to cultivate the land and abandon the nomadic lifestyle. Located in what we call the Fertile Crescent, this privileged region offered its inhabitants the opportunity to produce their own food, prosper, and build solid walls that seemed impenetrable. It is no wonder that many believed Jericho would never be conquered. However, the Bible describes in Joshua 6:1-2 that even though it was closed and protected on account of the children of Israel, God declared to Joshua that that city, its king, and its warriors would be delivered into his hands. For those who lived protected by gigantic walls and surrounded by wealth, that sounded impossible. But Jericho was not simply a city full of luxury and prosperous commerce. Behind the ostentation, there was an environment filled with idolatry and customs that deeply displeased God. Instead of revering the Creator, the inhabitants worshipped strange gods, even performing child sacrifices and obscure rituals that reflected a complete corruption of values. It was a place where error became the norm, and immorality was so common that no one noticed how far they were from the right path. Before discussing the role of women in this context, it is worth remembering that Jericho's history is intertwined with the beginning of civilization. While many peoples were still in search of game and shelter, Jericho already boasted fortified structures and advanced agricultural knowledge for its time. This advantage allowed for rapid growth and a false sense of invincibility that would soon be put to the test. Imagine crossing the desert and finding a spring of fresh water capable of transforming everything around it into a true oasis. It was this gift from nature that made Jericho a unique place, a city in the midst of aridity, surrounded by palm trees, date plantations, wheat, and barley. It is no coincidence that the book of Deuteronomy 34:3 calls it the City of Palms. Thanks to this source of life, Jericho prospered quickly, becoming a must-stop for travelers and merchants in the Jordan Valley. But Jericho stood out not only for its water and agriculture. From very early on, its inhabitants mastered advanced construction techniques, erecting stone walls so solid that no one believed they could be breached. This strategic vision transformed the city into a powerful trading hub, where salt, spices, fine fabrics, and precious metals circulated, enriching its residents and reinforcing the feeling of invincibility. Yet history proves that when man accumulates wealth and power without honoring God, corruption soon finds room. Although Jericho shone in the eyes of visitors, a dark side was spreading within. Rulers and the elite indulged in unbridled luxury, fueled by the profits of commerce, while idolatry gained ground. Various temples were erected to worship strange gods, in rituals involving human sacrifices and ceremonies of sacred prostitution. The pursuit of limitless pleasure and the exaggerated confidence in the walls led the people to completely forget the Creator. Thus, the city that was born from a divine gift, the water in the midst of the desert, descended into practices contrary to the will of God. The oasis of life and prosperity gradually became a stage for excesses and immoralities, to the point that its own wealth transformed into the root of the destruction that would follow. The inhabitants of Jericho believed that nothing could shake their security, as they trusted blindly in their enormous walls and the deities they worshipped. Everything seemed justified: corruption, immoral practices, idolatry. For them, prosperity and the supposed protection of the gods were proof that they were on the right path. However, history itself shows that when human arrogance ignores the principles of God, the consequences can be devastating. Powerful civilizations such as Rome or the legendary Sodom and Gomorrah also plunged into moral decay before their destruction. Jericho's trajectory serves as an example to illustrate how an obsession with pleasures and wealth without respect for the Creator can lead to everything going awry. And even today, it is not difficult to see this pattern repeating. The unbridled pursuit of money and pleasure, coupled with the disregard for spiritual values, still drags many toward ruin. Within the walls of Jericho, there was a particularly grim scenario regarding the role of women. While some, connected to nobility and commerce, held a certain influence, the majority lived in a state of subjugation. They were bargaining chips in marriages, currency in political alliances, or offered in religious rituals that claimed to guarantee prosperity and fertility. Thus, feminine beauty became a resource used to satisfy the interests of priests and leaders, leaving these women with no control over their own destiny. Ceremonies in pagan temples, especially those dedicated to deities such as Baal and Astarte, included sexual relations considered sacred, and, often, the sacrifice of the innocent. All of this was seen by the inhabitants as a normal part of their religiosity, something that supposedly would attract blessings and abundance. Yet, the Word of God always warned against such practices. In Leviticus 18:24-25, it becomes evident that the Creator not only reproves these attitudes but also acts to correct nations that persist in them. In other words, any society that walks down this path of moral degradation will sooner or later face the consequences of its choices. So, have you noticed how history keeps showing us the same cycle of rise, excess, and fall? Leave your opinion in the comments. After all, understanding the mistakes of the past is one of the best ways to prevent them from repeating in the present. Jericho lived under a false sense of security. Its inhabitants trusted so much in the gigantic walls and the local gods that they didn't even consider the possibility of being defeated. While immorality ran rampant, with idolatrous practices and rituals that involved the exploitation of women, there was someone who saw beyond it all: Rahab. Unlike the nobility or the priests, she had no prestige whatsoever. She was known simply as the prostitute whose house was built upon the city walls, receiving travelers and merchants from all around. It was precisely in that unlikely place that two spies from Israel found refuge. Rahab, upon hearing stories about the God of Israel and his miraculous deeds on behalf of his people, sensed that no human fortress could withstand divine power. Convinced that her walls would not survive God's judgment, she made the decision to protect the spies and plead for mercy from the true God. Thanks to that faith, Rahab and her family were spared on the day Jericho fell. Many ancient cities, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, also adopted practices that deeply offended the Creator, and all faced tragic consequences. Babylon plunged into debauchery and turned against God, paying a high price. For Jericho, the symbolic weight was even greater. It was the first city to be conquered when the people of Israel entered the Promised Land. It was as if God was making it clear that where He establishes His purpose, there is no room for the idolatry that dominates the human heart. And this is not limited to ancient times. If we look around, we can see that the same type of pride and attachment to pleasures has repeated throughout history and continues today. Leave your comment. Can you see parallels between today's society and Jericho's arrogance? If you believe that God remains sovereign, write in the comments, "Jesus is my fortress." As for the siege of the city, imagine the surprise of the inhabitants when they saw the Israelite army, led by Joshua, simply marching silently around the walls. Without direct attacks or attempts at scaling, everything seemed incomprehensible. For 6 days, that strange people encircled Jericho, accompanied by priests blowing trumpets. Then, on the 7th day, the divine strategy was revealed, and what seemed unbreakable crumbled before the power of the Lord. On the morning of the 7th day, as recorded in Joshua 6:15-16, the people of Israel rose early and circled Jericho 7 times. When the priests sounded their trumpets on the 7th circuit, Joshua commanded the people to shout with all their might, and at that moment, the city's walls, considered indestructible, fell to the ground without the Israelites having to physically breach their defenses. Some researchers suggest that an earthquake generated by the geological fault in the Jordan Valley may have coincided with the shout, toppling the structures. Others propose that fear and psychological tension shook the defenders, facilitating the collapse. But for those who believe in the power of God, there is no doubt. He Himself brought down the walls to fulfill His promise to the people of Israel. After all, no common war strategy explains how such solid barriers could fall so suddenly. The capture of Jericho was more than a military episode. It served as a warning to the nations of Canaan. The God of Israel was doing what He had promised His people, leaving neighboring kings and cities fearful. For Israel, it was confirmation that the same God who parted the Red Sea was now destroying fortresses, demonstrating that nothing can stand in the way of divine will. And what about you? What are the walls that seem insurmountable in your life? Fear, uncertainty, sins, or problems that appear to have no solution. The story of Jericho shows that when God acts, even the most resistant barriers come down. If you believe that He can tear down those obstacles, declare in the comments, "My victory comes from the Lord." After learning about the fall of Jericho, perhaps you want to discover what happened to other cities that also defied God. There is an even darker example, Sodom and Gomorrah, where depravity reached its limit. Have you ever wondered why these cities were consumed by the fire of heaven? Does archaeology have something to say about it? Click on the video appearing on the screen to learn more about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and what this story, so ancient, continues to teach us today.